Welcome to the Hope After Narcissistic Abuse podcast. I am your host, Amy Helms. Each week, you will hear from experts across the country and even world speak to you on recovering from narcissistic abuse and even how to manage these relationships. You will also hear some periodic solo episodes on how to manage these relationships and what recovery is like. It is my hope that you will leave each episode with some renewed hope that you can and will beat this. Thank you for tuning in. Hi, welcome to another episode of Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. On today's episode, I'm excited to welcome Laura Reagan. Laura is an integrative trauma therapist, consultant, and coach, supporting trauma therapists and other healers around the world to grow personally and professionally so they can achieve optimal well-being while maximizing their positive impact in the world. Laura is passionate about spreading the message that trauma is real, healing is possible, and help is available. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. So fun being on the other side of the mic.
Yes. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you're doing now, life, professionally?
Sure. I'll start with professionally because that's a little easier to say what I'm doing, but I own a group practice. I'm a trauma therapist located outside of Baltimore, and I'm not directly working with clients right now myself, but I'm honored to be able to mentor some newer therapists and therapists who've worked with me for a long time in my practice. So it's beautiful to guide and teach the new grads. And I also have Therapy Chat Podcast, which is a podcast I've been doing since 2015, where I talk about different types of working with trauma, so different ways of working with trauma, interviewing people about that. And I have a second podcast that's kind of like hibernating right now called Trauma Chat. One season has been released, but the rest is still in my mind and heart somewhere, waiting to come out. And then I have a platform called Trauma Therapist Network is the newest thing I'm doing, which I'm spending a lot of time and energy in, and because you're part of it, where it's a place for people to learn about trauma and find a trauma therapist. It's also where my podcasts live, and then it's grown into a support network for trauma therapists, which wasn't my original intention, but it's what a beautiful evolution for me. It's so enjoyable to get to be with trauma therapists every week and talk about our work. It's so, because I'm fascinated by it, even after 20 years of doing this work, going on 21. It's just endlessly interesting and complex. And especially as we learn more and more all the time about how we're affected by trauma and our attachment wounds and how we can really heal. So
we're thankful for it because, you would think there's a lot of trauma therapists, but there really are not. And so, especially the past few years, it's more than needed to have a place for people to do this trauma work, to come together and to collaborate and learn these new ways and keep up.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. And yeah, and then so personally, what I'm doing in my life is I'm an empty nester. I have two kids who've graduated from college and living on their own. And so I'm in the space of having elderly parents and navigating their health challenges as they come up, and sort of, to be really open, like sort of navigating the long journey of healing from childhood trauma that I've been on myself takes on a new direction when your parents are reaching the ends of their lives. And it's kind of been a surprisingly beautiful opportunity to repair and heal. Not that always happens for people, but I've been fortunate that opportunity has been available for me with my parents. So it's been a really bittersweet process.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Trauma attachment wounds, you mentioned. We talked in a few episodes, and even the second episode Brenda Stevens was on, she wrote the Narcissistic Abuse Recovery Workbook, but we really haven't dug into, what attachment wounds are, what attachment is. Can you speak a little bit about attachment wounds? What do, I know, but, our listeners, can you dig into that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, and I think attachment wounds are the thing that is like the invisible hurt that we have, that so many of us, almost all of us, are carrying some wounds of moments during our earliest years. I mean, from infancy through adulthood, moments where we felt unwanted, unseen, unheard, rejected, abandoned, betrayed, even deeply disappointed, where we needed something emotionally and our attachment figure or the person that we were counting on or trusting to meet that need at the time didn't, for whatever reason, whether they couldn't or they weren't there, so they didn't know, or they had some kind of a negative reaction to our need because of their unmet needs and may have even done something abusive towards us. That's what I'm thinking of when I say attachment needs. So I was talking with a clinician earlier today who was talking about how they tried to screen for childhood trauma when they were working with potential new clients, even speaking with them on the phone to determine whether this person has any childhood trauma because they may have felt like that wasn't something that they were skilled in working with. And then, asking the potential client if they have any, and the person says no. And then once you start working together, it's a huge question. And we think we don't because, and I think this is what the real attachment wounds are, is that we as children have a need, whether it's a need for attention, a need for connection, or a need for autonomy. There are all these different developmental needs that we have as children, which our parents may or may not understand at all, and are limited by their own blind spots where theirs weren't met. And they may miss a lot of our needs because of those unmet needs that they have. And we do the same to our kids, or we can if we're not consciously aware of them. So I feel like the wounds are when there's a need, you're a child, you have a need, the parent doesn't see it or doesn't meet it, or they try to meet it and they get it wrong. And then internally, we just sort of have this message to ourselves, oh, I'm bad, or I shouldn't have that need, or, I'm wrong for wanting whatever I wanted or for trying to get that need met. The parent may tell us that we're wrong, or it may just be that they don't get it right. And we internalize that message to make ourselves not lose connection with the parent.
Right. Or it can be like that baby in the NICU that wasn't held, and the parent obviously it's not their fault, but baby's just laying there, bright lights, machines beeping, chaos, and they weren't held.
Exactly. So it wasn't anybody's intention to abandon that baby, but the experience for the baby is feeling a need that isn't being met and needing to have some way of making sense of why isn't it being met. It can't be because my caregiver doesn't love me or they're bad, because that would be a survival threat to me. I need to believe that they're going to take care of me, or else that's a life threat to me. So that's unbearable. So instead of thinking that there's something about them, we think that there's something about us. And as an infant, what thinking there is really feeling and sensing with the body. So there's in the body this experience of being not held when you need to be held, and whatever meaning was made from that. I don't deserve to be held. I'm not loved, whatever, it's individual to each person what meaning we make from it, but then that becomes the way we interact with the world. So one of the things that I've noticed about myself with attachment wounds is that I've noticed as I've become more mindfully present to my own needs, I've noticed that there's a part of me that expects to be met with a negative response by other people. So, you could make a meaning of that, like people don't like you, people don't want you, no one's really happy to see you. And those are like really small things you don't think about. But when a child comes into a room and there's an adult attachment figure there, the child wants the adult to be happy that they came in, right? And if they're not, then it's like not being received with joyful welcome, you know? And that can be internalized as, there's something about me that just people don't like me. So you begin to interact with the world in a way where you expect that, and then you don't, you're guarded, you don't open up because, you need to protect yourself because you think unconsciously, not consciously, but you just sort of operate from that. You and I are on videos, so I keep like doing with my body because it's like your body is operating from that way. Even as I'm talking about it, I'm
Right. Yeah.
moving.
Yeah, and I'm divorced, and my children don't have a relationship with. My ex-husband, I have to say now, is still getting used to it because he doesn't have parental rights anymore. But one of my children has trouble asking for anything out of fear of getting in trouble or other things. But it's still, even with myself or my parents or at school, it's just this response, and so she'll whisper, is it okay if I get a snack? And so we're really working with her on, I'll even say, ask for a snack, damn it, it's okay. And she's like, is it okay? And I'm like, yes. And so just, learning to be assertive and that it's okay to have a voice, but that wound is still present. And similar to what you were talking about, it's coming into a room and wanting to see joy, not coming into a room and needing to be silent or hidden and not having needs.
Yes. And so even if the parent, let's say the child walks into the room and the parent's sitting there and they just got an email that said your power's about to get cut off because you didn't pay your bill on time. And they're worrying about, how am I going to come up with that money? And the child at that moment comes in and says, hey, guess what I just did? And they're like, shh. It's not intentional necessarily. I mean, of course, there's abuse, and that's very real, and that causes attachment wounds too. But I think one of the things I want to highlight is that oftentimes people don't realize that it doesn't have to be experiences of abuse and violence, or even directly being told, shut up, or something like that, to feel like, oh, my big feelings, my excitement is a problem for them. I need to be less, and you hear all the time people saying, like, I know I'm a lot, I know I'm too much, so it's just so insidious. And I feel like it's really important to talk about attachment for that reason, because there's all these experiences where we kind of disconnect from ourselves to stay in service to the relationship with our caregiver, because we need that for survival. And then those make up like the way we see the world and how we do all of our relationships throughout the rest of our lives.
How does it carry with us throughout our lives? What have you observed in all your work?
Well, I think, again, it's so subtle that we don't know we're doing it. We think we're just interacting, totally consciously, but there's so much unconscious material that we don't know is there, that is held in our bodies and in the parts of our mind that we're not able to access, pre-verbal and non-verbal memory from, maybe your first 10 years of life. Most of that memory is really more implicit and not things that you can just directly recall each experience, but they shaped the way you see the world and the way you feel about yourself and other people, how safe you feel, how much you trust yourself and others. So, for example, the example you gave with your child of, kind of, is it okay for me to ask for a snack, is a question of, is it safe for me to feed myself when I'm hungry or be fed, right? So it's like, can I safely take care of my physical need for food. If that's the way if we get a message that it isn't safe, then how will that impact, appetite, anxiety, how comfortable you can feel when you're eating, how safe you feel to eat around other people, if the other person might get upset. This is like a tiny, tiny example of ways that it can affect the person, like in the more acute time after they've had some kind of a reason to have that reaction. But over time, it may just be like, oh, I'm a picky eater, or, I may have sensory reactions to certain textures and foods and things like that. Or it can lead into, beyond food, just how comfortable, like you said, assertiveness. How comfortable do you feel asking for anything that you need? And how much are you able to use your voice? Like you said, she whispers, and you're working on getting it out.
And I work with eating disorders with trauma, and I see this playing out, 30, 40 years later. And I even have some people in their 60s and 70s. And it comes out that, well, when I was 10, this happened or this happened. And just seeing it play out in my own family, which is not by any means on an eating disorder level, but it's kind of fascinating seeing it play out and then hearing these stories in my own practice that it's an attachment wound.
Right. And, not to use your child's example as, like, we're not talking about your child really, but just this way that this can happen for people. But like you just explained, your kid is going through something, and you are a professional in this work. And I'm not going to say how you feel, but it could be. I know for me, when my children dealt with things that either I had seen clients deal with, suffer from, or things that I had been through. And a lot of it really does come out in parenting, is when our attachment wounds really begin to be present for us. And I think that most people are not really going to be able to do their healing of their attachment work until it comes to an adult relationship, and possibly a caregiving relationship of some kind, or parenting, because that is what kind of activates that same part of your system, and you reenact those same patterns. So, when we see someone we care about have a problem that is important to us for some reason, whether it's our own experience or something that we've specialized in, like, of course, if my child goes through a trauma and I'm a trauma therapist, I know how important it is to really take it seriously and help. But it's also very scary and painful to see them go through that, because that's the one thing that, you never want to happen.
Right. It also makes you more passionate about the need for trauma therapists.
Exactly. Because then when you get your kids, you try to get your kids therapy and you figure out how hard it is to find one. Believe me, that's, not thinking about just my kids, but in general. That's why I created the Trauma Therapist Network as a directory to begin with, because I was so upset at trying to find therapists who, for people I cared about, or people who would contact me from the podcast and ask me, well, who would you recommend? Or I live in this state. Do you know any good therapists there? And I would look, I'd be like, oh, where are all the trauma therapists? I know they must exist, but where are they?
Yeah. They're like, oh, wait, in my practice.
Oh, I have to open a group practice.
So, how do we begin to heal from attachment wounds?
Oh, yeah. That's a big question. I would say, well, the first step is really kind of what we're talking about, that you have to realize that you have them.
Yeah. So, how do we realize?
Well, I think that how is to be really compassionate with yourself and realize that the pain that you feel, whatever it is there for some reason. Because if you ever have thoughts like, there's something wrong with me, or I'm not like other people, or no one likes me, no one cares about me, no one will ever be there for me, I'm on my own, I can't count on anyone but myself. These are the kinds of thoughts that children have when they're trying to figure out the grown-up world without guidance from grown-ups who are able to really be attuned to and attend to their needs. So if you find yourself having those thoughts, that's a beginning clue that there could be some unmet needs. And the truth is, just to be really frank, for anyone who's listening, going, "Oh no, I've ruined my kid," like, like nobody is going to have all of their attachment needs during childhood. So, when we think about, do I have a secure attachment style or an insecure attachment style, or a disorganized attachment style? It's more about how secure were your attachments with your caregivers. And maybe, and most of the time, one of your caregivers was safe, and certain times they were extremely unsafe. That's going to create one way of being with attachment. But then maybe your other caregiver was really safe all the time, but then they missed something really important. Or one time you had a major thing. It's kind of like assessing, looking at those relationships and thinking about, how safe do I feel in this relationship? And there's a really good way to explore attachment that is usually done with a therapist, but the adult attachment inventory is one where I have found that very helpful to, and the way that Dan Siegel kind of modified it to make it a little bit less wordy, maybe it's just a little more palatable, it seems. It's a really good way to get to what was missing with attachment. So it's like, kind of, and what I've found is one of the important questions is, who helped you when you were scared? Because people are like, yeah, my parents were always there for me. And then they'll say, well, the only time I ever felt like my parents weren't really there for me is that I would be really scared when they were fighting. And it's like, okay, well, how could they be there for you while they're fighting? Because they're doing this and you're over here by yourself. So if you feel like they were always there for you, but then I'm picturing a child whose parents are fighting and the child's just scared and like hearing it, but nobody's with the child. Well,
Or
there's
having
the
to
wound.
comfort siblings.
Oh, yeah. If you're bringing
Yeah.
siblings close and you're comforting them, so then you might be like, it was okay. I always took care of my siblings. I wasn't scared, but really, you're just holding space for them, but nobody's holding space for you. So it's really like identifying where those wounds were and then how they're affecting you in your relationships. Because if you're in relationships with, let's say you have a partner and you're like, they're never here for me. They're never here for me. I can't count on them, or I don't believe them. I always feel like they're sneaking around or they're going to betray me in some way. Like, those kinds of feelings, again, are clues that there's a trust issue. And trust is what attachment basically creates. You can trust yourself and your partners and the other people in your life if you have a more secure attachment relationship with your caregivers from childhood. And if it wasn't as secure, then you might have ways of coping that feel like, and that would be like, I can count on no one but myself. That's a way of trying to cope. Well, the only person I can count on is myself. If you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. Things like that just means I can't count on anybody else to do stuff. So I have to do everything. Then you end up feeling like overburdened and resentful and like a martyr. So
does it set up for a healthy relationship?
No, because the other person, even if they were going to try to do their part, you're so insistent, you believe you're the only one who can do it. So you don't really see their part in it because you're kind of just like reliving what you experienced in childhood.
So what are other ways it shows up as an adult in relationships?
I would say it shows up in finding it really hard to connect on an emotional level. So and I feel like this is so culturally normal in the Western hemisphere, in North, like Western European influenced culture. It's like, we don't talk about feelings. We just focus on working hard. And, then we do a lot of other things to distract ourselves from ever feeling. Like, using a lot of substances, numbing with food, numbing with overwork. So being emotionally kind of avoidant is definitely a clue that emotional expression was not encouraged when you were growing up, and it may not have been safe. So you had to learn how to just kind of disconnect from it.
Yeah. My son told one of his teachers that she was really frustrating him.
That's good.
And I was like, what do you want me to do? He told you how he was feeling.
He's using his words.
I told him I was proud of it.
Well, and that's an example of like, if you were focused only on obedience, then that might be a problem for you, that he said to the teacher, I feel frustrated by your behavior or what you're doing. This is frustrating, but focusing only on obedience does, squelch. I'm like using my hands. It's like it squashes the creative, joyful expression of childhood. And that's what children are. They're just like,
I was like, he told you how he felt.
Exactly.
And it's not heard at someone at his age who's feeling worse. And we talked a little bit about like how the unmet needs create boundary issues.
Oh, yeah. Well, I think if you weren't allowed to express an opposing view, so again, like with your son, if he was taught he's not allowed to say no, then he has to suppress his no. And like your daughter, same thing. For her, it's like with the example you used, it was needing to ask for something. And if for him, he was not allowed to say that he disagreed with something, then his no is not allowed to be heard. So because we have to squash that feeling of dissent from inside, the part of you that's going, hey, I don't like this. This doesn't feel good to me. This doesn't feel right, whatever. We have to squash that. So then when we want to say, hey, I don't like this, I don't want to do that, I'm not willing to do that, that's not okay with me, it's sort of like we can't access that. So, again, it's just so great what you're doing, like how you're really explicitly helping your kids challenge those.
Yeah. Oh, his assignment on westward expansion was great, but teacher didn't like it. He was asked to write about his feelings about it. And he said that, it was stupid and dumb and humanity would have been better off without it.
He's not wrong.
And the teacher said that if he could have said it was stupid and dumb, but he needed to cite evidence. And he said, I did. It was genocide. And the teacher argued with him. And I said, well, let's just leave it at this, buddy, but you were right.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, maybe stupid and dumb wasn't specific enough, but genocide pretty much captures exactly why it was not a good idea.
That's the point. She argued with it. She didn't believe that part. And I was like, okay, buddy, you were right, but we'll leave it at this. Good job.
Wow. Yeah. Watch out, that next generation. They know what's up.
Yeah. So you can tell a therapist child from the group.
Well, good. I love that. He's right. It really wasn't good for humanity at all.
Mm-hmm. So I've taught him that's, you can state your opinion, but then try not push the boundary over the edge.
It's hard because children don't have much power, and that's the thing. He's not wrong at all. He's actually right, but he doesn't have the power because he's a child to express his voice fully. And that's, I've heard that called childism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's 10, so.
Yeah. But I mean, that's part of the problem with the power, the abuse, the harm that we adults do to kids is that they depend on us, and we don't really treat them as the precious little, dependent beings that they are. We tend to like try to squash their spirit and make them be little robots so they can produce for the,
right.
the machine.
And so, boundaries typically have to be taught. It's like giving examples of like how I've taught them boundaries, but how do you teach boundaries or learn boundaries if you don't know them?
I think that for myself, I think that you have to use a somatic approach, really, a bottom-up approach, because You can talk about boundaries and say, hey, you have the right to say no. No one can touch you without your consent. No one can, take your ideas and tell you that they're not yours. But thinking and saying it is one thing. But, like,
To feel it
you
and
have to
sense
feel
it.
it and you have to like embody it, or it doesn't, because if you're just like, well, I should say no to this because I don't agree with it, but I really don't feel my no. I just am saying no, but it doesn't, the energy of it's not there. Like, the other person is likely to just push back and be able to kind of trample on you because you don't even believe what you're saying. It's like you really feel no, but you can't access that energy. And then they don't hear it and they just keep pushing, and you may back down, which isn't your fault. They should respect your no, and it doesn't become effective. In my experience, at first I wasn't saying my no or my limit or whatever it was. And then I started saying it and thinking that the person would respect it if I said it. And I feel like this is kind of like the stages of learning to set boundaries. We also tend to get like kind of overzealous at, hey, stop, no, like really too strident with it when we're first practicing. But you have to embody it and then act on it. So it's not just like, Amy, I'm not going to let you do that to me, and then I wait for you to say, okay, I won't. If you don't, and you go, well, I'm going to do it anyway, then I have to do something to change the thing.
Right. And it was interesting because I'm somatically trained. And in the training, we practice the boundaries by people coming toward us or moving away and saying no. But it was different depending on the person and their level or the size, male, female, and sensing inside, okay, well, that person's 10 feet away. Okay, that's my point. Stop there. But other people, it was okay if they came really close. So just paying attention to the proximity and why were some people okay if they were closer, not others. That was really eye-opening to me.
Oh yeah, I agree. And that, to that point, it's like, if you were to say it feels best when this person's 10 feet away from me, then you might make meaning of, I need people to be 10 feet away from me for me to be comfortable. But like you said, it felt fine for them to be close. So it's really about trusting your own sense of what feels right in every situation. And that's a lot different from sort of, sometimes it's like, we think of boundaries in this very simplistic way where it's like, no one's allowed to do this, and again, sometimes you just start where you are and what's okay with me and what's not okay with me. But I think we find, as part of that like development of setting boundaries process, it's like, what's not okay with me is easier to identify, but what I do want or what's okay with me is still like, oh, I don't know. So it's a real self exploration process, and feeling and sensing into what comes up for you as everything's happening. So it's kind of like that inner mindfulness and the between you and the other person awareness as well.
So what are some other ways that you practice boundaries somatically?
Well, there are a lot of ways that you can do, like what you said with standing distance apart. You can also use structures like, what does it feel like if I'm behind this, or if I put this between us? How much does it feel like I'm taking in this person's energy? Because for many people, especially people who have early trauma, it's pretty common to be very kind of sensory perceptive. Some people might call it like hypersensitive or too sensitive or highly sensitive, or empathic. There's the HSP, there's the empath. People talk about this in a lot of different ways, but just to really be tuned into what you're feeling with the other person. And when sometimes you may need to put a boundary between you, that's a physical boundary for yourself to be able to stay in your like grounded embodied self. So yeah, I mean, you can, setting boundaries is a verbal thing, but it can also be putting distance between yourself and other people. It can be And since we're talking about narcissistic abuse, one thing that people talk about a lot is going no contact. And then some people think I have to go no contact or I'm not setting any boundaries, but there's a lot in between of, it's really just determining.
Yeah, you can go, well, no verbal. And then there's also, well, there's text only or email only. There's a lot of gray, or we're only going to communicate about the kids, only communicate about XYZ. But there's so much in between.
Certain topics are off limit. Yeah. And how much you physically are exposed to them, how much time you spend with them. So a lot of people who have like maybe their family of origins, communication and boundaries are pretty dysfunctional, and don't really work for the person, but they still do want to have a relationship with those people. So they say, when I go over there, I'll stay for an hour. And then what happens is you're there and everything's going okay. And you're like, oh, maybe I could stay longer. Then you stay for 2 hours and things really devolve in that second hour. And you go, oh, an hour was my limit there. And I should have honored my own boundary, because we violate our own boundaries too, because, we kind of, things are going all right. We don't see a reason to uphold it, especially when we want things to be nice with those people.
Yeah, or little things like, I'm going to go to bed at this time. Well, no, I'm going to get one more thing done. And then we stay up later. It throws our schedule off.
Exactly. And then the next day we're like, why do I feel bad?
Great. So a lot of ways people can practice boundaries, not just with people, but their own schedule, or, with proximity people. They could do it at the grocery store. If walking down the aisle, how do I feel when this person's approaching? Inside, what am I sensing?
I'll tell you, at the grocery store, it's like how close that person is behind me. I hope you have a cart between us. I don't want to feel your breath on my neck. That's too close.
Mm-hmm. I sense that when I walk into the car.
Yeah.
That last few feet to the car is like a race. Dive it in.
You're like walking along, suddenly you're running. But it's also like, how well do we respect other people's boundaries too? And I think, there's so many ways that we don't necessarily realize that we're not respecting other people's boundaries. Like, oh, come on, don't you want a bite of this? Or, oh, just stay a little bit longer. Person says, I have to go now. Oh, can you take 5 more minutes? And you don't think you're really being rude and you're asking, but at the same time, you're sort of, they already told you what their limit was. And maybe you're saying it nicely. And what you're really saying might be, I don't want you to leave now, but you're not saying that. You're using like trying to control their behavior to get your needs met. So that's something that I think is an important part of boundaries too. I think we think a lot about how other people react to our boundaries, but we don't always notice how we might inadvertently violate other people's boundaries.
I think sometimes with coming out of relationships that aren't healthy, finally having a voice, sometimes it's easy to use that voice and not necessarily how to gauge it. Is it too much? Is it not enough? And it's a practice.
It is a practice. And there's some like hard to put into words quality of how much we are present to the other person in the interaction and how much we're present to ourselves. I feel like, we can kind of be in this little bit of a bubble where we're just reacting to our own inner world, and everything that's happening around us can be just, we're not taking it in really. We're just in our little bubble. I think that's, I think I mentioned, I might have mentioned the word dissociation before, but I think about that because, when you're in operating the way that things were then, but you're in your life now, which is not then, but you're still operating in that same way, then you're really not responsive to what's actually happening around you. You might have a foot in now and a foot in the past. And it really prevents closeness again in relationships. So going back to that thing of people who don't feel emotionally connected to other people, it's like you're kind of in that little bubble yourself, just within your own experience. And people might say, I feel like I can't reach you. Like, I don't know how to get in, I'm doing like a knocking.
Yeah, put up a wall, not just a boundary around yourself.
Yeah. And you don't think you do, because maybe you're like doing everything for other people without maybe them even asking you to. Sometimes, you're anticipating their needs and doing stuff and carrying all this burden, and they're like, if you could see me, you would know it's not even what I'm wanting.
Didn't ask for it, don't need it, no thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's like so much coming from the right place and the right intentions, but not attuned to the present.
Great points. So, any final words of advice, tips for someone going through this process?
I guess I would just say just a couple of simple little thoughts. Try to be open and curious and give yourself a lot of grace, a lot of compassion, because it's so vulnerable to try to navigate relationships from a way that's more relationally attuned to yourself and the other person when you didn't get that. And so you're going to make mistakes and it's going to feel confusing, and what seems simple to other people might not seem simple to you, but it's like you said, it's a practice. So it's like something you get better at. It takes time. You have to just go through it to begin to feel more sure of yourself. But every time you do get that reinforcement that you're on the right track, it'll help build those new neural pathways that we're always working on.
The vulnerability and the newness can be scary, but it's not going to be as scary as the old. So it's something to remember, and that healing is totally possible. I don't think either of us would be doing this work if it wasn't.
Exactly. Well, we wouldn't be here.
Yeah. This reminder is that, every day that feels hard is not going to be anywhere near as hard as it was living in the abuse or the really tough part. Your podcast will be linked in the show notes, but do you want to tell people how they can find you?
Sure. Yeah. Everything that I'm doing is found on Trauma Therapist Network, so that's traumatherapistnetwork.com. Unless people are in Maryland and they're looking for therapy, then they could use our group practice website, which is bahealing.com.
Wonderful. And that will be linked as well. Thank you so much. It was so fun talking to you, and I know our listeners are going to gain a lot. And so please tune in next week for another episode. And thank you so much. Thank you again for tuning in to our podcast, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. We hope you were able to leave with some renewed hope. And if you like what you heard, please subscribe to the channel, give us a review, head to the show notes for more information on the things that we highlighted. And there's also a link to the website for a course that we offer on the same topic, Hope After Narcissistic Abuse. Thank you again, and please tune in to the next episode.